Welcome back to the Back to Basics series, and today we pick up with part 2 of talking about radios. If you missed part 1, then you can go back and watch it, then come back here and watch this one, or watch this one, then go back and watch that one, or whatever. Point is, this is part 2. Before we get into listening to some radio traffic, let's talk a little bit about the 3 methods of communication: simplex, duplex, and repeated. Simplex is by far the most common method for the railroads. All radios talk and listen on the same frequency. In order to hear radio traffic, you need to be within range of it. Duplex is slightly more complicated in that the radios transmit and receive on different frequencies. The most common application of this is where repeaters are used. They take whatever they hear on their input frequency and, repeat it on their output frequency. Because repeaters are usually higher powered and have higher antennas, their range is wider than simplex, and you only need to be able to hear the output frequency to hear all traffic through it. Repeaters are occasionally used near yards, but aren't very common elsewhere. With that out of the way, let's get into the types of channels. The one you'll most often want to listen to is called the road channel, and is where you'll find virtually anything you'd need to know. Defect detectors, train-to-train communication, usually switching, and usually train-to-dispatcher or dispatcher-to-train communication. Some railroads put the dispatcher on their own channel, so each line will have a road and a dispatch channel. CSX widely does this, as does CN here in the Chicago area, and I think on former Grand Trunk territory. Not sure about the former Wisconsin Central. The road channel, or dispatcher channel if there is one, is also where you'll hear dispatchers giving trains track authority, either through a form like the EC1 on CSX, or signal indication in CTC territory. Even where the dispatcher is on their own channel, they can typically switch to the road channel to either handle whatever they need to, or tell a train to switch to their channel to do it. This means trains only have to monitor the road channel, but can still switch over and talk to the dispatcher on their own channel if needed. We also need to talk about something that is a great way to tell when a train is near: calling signals over the air.
Clear 134, 5757.
I believe most railroads have a rule that signal aspects must be communicated between all crew members in the cab, but not all railroads require this to be done over the air, and verbally is just fine. Both G-Corps Rule 2.12 and NORAC Rule 712 prohibit communications about fixed signal indications on the radio except when needed by a crew to communicate it between themselves, and trains can't even ask for this information from a dispatcher who doesn't have the information anyway. This is why for controlled signals, the dispatcher tells the train to look for a signal indication. It also does not prevent a dispatcher giving a train permission to pass an absolute signal at stop. We'll get into this a little more when I do a deeper dive into signal systems, which will be the next episode in this series. Spoiler. The road channel, with very, very few exceptions that I can think of, is simplex. Remember, to hear simplex channels, you usually need to be pretty close. Dispatcher towers transmit with more power and higher antennas and can be heard over a greater distance. Locomotive radios are relatively high-powered, but the antennas are located lower, and so their range is smaller. Handheld radios used by crew members are typically low power, and their range is even smaller. Typically, when a train wants to call a dispatcher, they put their radio on the appropriate channel, either the road channel or the dispatcher channel if they're separate, and send a series of DTMF tones similar to how dialing a phone used to work. The employee timetable will list the tones needed to activate the dispatcher. The dispatcher tower that receives the call will then respond with an acknowledgement tone, which is different depending on the railroad. CSX, CPKC, NS, BNSF, UP, and I'd put a CN recording here if I actually had one. If they're remote, the dispatcher will then get a notification on their screen that something is requesting a call, and it'll enter into their queue. When they get to the call in their queue, they'll switch to the tower on which it was received and take care of whatever is needed. Dispatcher towers can also be used to contact other departments using a different set of tones, such as the PTC Help Desk, Customer Support, Transportation Services, or Police. Dispatchers are very rarely nearby though. BNSF dispatches in Fort Worth, UP in Omaha, CPKC in Minneapolis and Kansas City, although I think they're consolidating into Kansas City, CSX in Jacksonville, NS in Atlanta, and CN in Homewood for, I think, the whole U.S.? I'm not sure on that one, but all the lines around here are dispatched out of Homewood, and the dispatcher's ID as CN Desk whatever Homewood. Not everyone is remote, though. CPKC Tower B-17 is staffed locally and controls the whole western part of the Elgin sub. JB Tower in West Chicago and Tower A2 down in Chicago are other examples. UP has a separate commuter control operator from the Chicago terminal operator, but I'm not sure if they're local or just a separate desk in Omaha. The next type of channel we'll talk about is yard. This one gets a little bit complicated. Small yards may only use a single channel or not even have their own separate from the road channel, while bigger yards will use multiple channels with specific uses. This is also the most common place to find repeaters, although they're still not very widespread. As you may know, my main focus is on the CPKC Bensonville yard most of the time, and according to the 2016 Cora guide, there are 5 individual channels in use for the yard. Channel 65 is used in the West Yard and Intermodal Yard, and I think this includes Schiller Park too. Channel 88 is used for arrivals and departures, A Yard and D Yards, respectively, and the Bensonville General Trainmaster. Channel 34 is used in the F Yard, which is the northernmost section of the facility. Channel 84 is used in the C Yard, which was formerly the Hump Yard, but is now just a regular classification yard. Finally, Channel 24 is the Mechanical Department, and this channel actually uses a repeater. Any train leaving yard limits in either direction will either call the CPKC Elgin dispatcher to the east, or Tower B-17 to the west on the road channel for the sub, 94. Although used more in the past than today, maintenance away crews have previously been assigned their own channels. Usually today they just operate on whatever the line's road channel is, which can cause problems for bigger work sites with more people and equipment. Railroad police also sometimes use their own channels, although many have switched over to statewide trunk radio systems. Here in Illinois, Metra, BNSF, UP, CPKC, CSX, and CN police are on digital trunk systems. NS police are on a regular channel in NXCN Digital near Chicago, and Amtrak PD are on a regular old analog repeater still. As far as what channels are actually in use, you have a couple sources for information. The most accurate will likely be the radioreference.com database. If you have access to an old employee timetable, it'll also tell you. Radio assignments can change, but don't really very often, so don't worry if the timetable is a little out of date. There are other ways, such as using an antenna search that queries the FCC database, but that isn't going to be ideal for most users, and most of the time you can find what you're looking for elsewhere. So what does the radio actually sound like, and what are we listening to? Well, let's take a little road trip and radio rail fan along the way. We're starting out in Franklin, Kentucky, then taking I-165 northwest towards Owensboro, then over to Evansville, and north along US 41 through Indiana. There will be plenty of opportunity for CSX trains, as the line through Evansville is the main Chicago to Nashville and beyond route. From Franklin to Bowling Green, we run along the CSX mainline sub, the former L&N main line between the two namesake cities. CSX typically uses separate dispatch and road channels, so on my dual receive radio I have both in. Channel 84, 161.370 is the road channel, and 94, 161.520 is dispatch. I end up not hearing anything on this stretch, although 165 crosses basically right over Memphis Junction. Once where the L&N split between lines to Nashville and Memphis, the Memphis line is now broken and owned by R.J. Corman, and the two railroads interchange here. Northwest of Bowling Green, there isn't much in the way of railroads, but we do cross the Paducah and Louisville near Beaver Dam, and I actually hear a train picking up a track warrant on their road channel. After not much to speak of through Owensboro and into Henderson, Kentucky, I switch back to 84 and 94 for the CSX through Evansville and north. And not too long after, around Princeton, Indiana, I hear something calling signals.
Iowa 2813 is 720 north, clear, South Princeton, number 28.
CSX requires all signals, regardless of indication, to be called out over the radio and the train identified, which makes figuring out what you're looking at very, very simple. It's I-028, Fairburn, Georgia to Bedford Park, Illinois intermodal. It activates the defect detector at 258.8.
Defect detector, milepost 258.8, no defect. Repeat, no defect. Total axle 312, length 7380, detector out.
720 north. Defect detector 258.8, no defect.
A little later, we hear from the dispatcher who has switched to the road channel to contact the train. Sometimes they'll tell the train to switch over to their channel, sometimes they won't. It just depends.
SP dispatcher M64714, over.
47, answer.
Yeah, we'll meet this I-28 there at Carlisle, just to give you a heads up. After we meet him, we'll have to duck in at Oaktown. There's a coal train at Oaktown. They want to grab the power off that coal train at Oaktown and take that way there to Evansville, over.
This time they're telling a southbound manifest M647 to pick up some locomotives on their way and take them to Evansville. M647 is a belt railway of Chicago to Waycross, Georgia manifest. They then call out the signal at Paxton.
Approach medium Paxton. 647. 5287 southbound.
Later we get dispatcher tones. And it's for a B796 marking up. B796 is a Tampa, Florida to Linden, Indiana ethanol empty train.
Speed dispatcher Jacksonville, answer, over.
B79608, dispatcher.
Go ahead, over.
I got a markup here if you're ready for it, over.
Give me 1 second here. I have to stand by 1 second. All right, go ahead when you're ready, over.
Alright, we are 3x96, got a CSXT 977, and behind us is a CSXT 5381, not DP capable. I got 4338 on the ton, 6041 on the length. PTC and TO are working, Mans and Lauritsen on duty 0820, day lead, sufficient power, 4,000 gallons of fuel in each, over.
Okay, all right. So enough fuel, enough power to the destination. Is that correct?
That's correct, over.
Okay, all right. I got the train ahead of you there. Let me find out what his plans are, and I'll, if you can see the signal there, we'll go signal indication, over.
Copy that, signal indication.
At Terre Haute, it'll branch away from the C, E, and D sub and take the St. Louis line east, and then up the Old Monon. Near Terre Haute, we hear an M500 working the yard there, and they're having a little trouble with PTC not showing their location correctly, so they're still occupying a signal plant when the computer thinks they're clear.
Speed dispatcher M513, over.
M500, over.
Yeah, I'm still showing you there in the OS at Spring Hill, over.
Yeah, I was afraid of that, but that's about all we can do, over.
Okay, I understand there.
After a lunch stop for us, M500 is still here but is ready to go.
SP dispatcher M513, over.
500, over.
You are all back on your train now, is that correct, over?
Got it together. We got a pump air on, and the conductor will be walking to the head end, over.
Okay, all right, 28 going by here shortly. We'll follow him, over.
They'll make one more stop in Danville before ending up at Bar Yard. North of Terre Haute, we don't hear much, and the C, E, and D branches away towards Danville. Although, we do hear the dispatcher talking to a B211 in the distance. B211 is a phosphate load train from down there in Distant Signals neck of the woods, Mulberry, Florida, to the CPKC at Bensonville.
SP dispatcher B21105, over. Yeah, are you all about ready, over? Minutes, I appreciate it. Speed dispatcher.
After that, we don't really hear much of anything, although we do drive along the NS former Danville branch. This was New York Central, and although it still sees use north of Schneider, Indiana, to the south it is abandoned, although there are still quite a few sections where rails and bridges are still intact but overgrown. Nothing really to note here, I just thought it was cool, and there are very few opportunities in most other videos I could talk about it. One final attempt to catch something before we get into Illinois, and I hear an M643 picking up authority to run southeast on the CSX Monon sub. The Monon is ABS territory, but not CTC, so the dispatcher issues an EC1.
Alright, show EC1 number 98356. 98356. Maintain 051423 at the DG 22.8 and 64214 Still more on the copy, triple line 1A, operate main track south direction. WAS Munster on the main track to the SAS Lieutenant Shelby on the main track.
Remember back to the track authority video that CSX has consolidated essentially all forms into the EC1, similar to the mandatory directive for NS or the Form D in the NORAC rulebook. Yard channels are usually extremely active, and not much of it is of interest outside of the yard itself, but listening to them can give you an idea of what's going on and what's coming. On some railroads, it's also likely your only chance to figure out train symbols. Perfect example is Rochelle. There are several trains that come and go from Global 3, but aren't really distinguishable from one another, but they may ID on the radio with their symbol. Last time I went out there, this happened. I'd have no idea what either of these trains were if it wasn't for IG3SK IDing both itself and IG3G4 in front of it. Speaking of symbols, how do you know what to listen for and find out what these trains are? The short answer is, it depends. Some railroads, like we've heard on CSX, frequently use symbols on the air. So does NS. CPKC frequently uses symbols on the air too, but will also use lead engine number. CN typically uses engine number, but occasionally you'll hear a symbol also used by the dispatcher. UP sometimes uses symbols near terminals, but otherwise it'll just be lead engine number. They tend to shorten them too, such as IG3SK being shortened to just SK. They also use nicknames, with coal trains coming from or going to Oak Creek, Wisconsin, usually just called Oak Creek no matter where in Wyoming they're coming or going. I don't think I've ever heard BNSF use symbols on the air, but if you're close enough to a terminal, you may hear them use nicknames. For example, listening to the Cicero Yard channel in the middle of the day, you'll often hear calls for the St. Paul that's being put together. This is ZCHC STP to, well, St. Paul. On the Belt Railway of Chicago's channels, you'll often hear them calling the KCK. This is BNSF HBRC KCK, or Brick Kick. GAL is a train to Galesburg. There are sometimes clues, you just have to really listen for them compared to some of the other roads. On BNSF, it's super important to know your territory when trying to figure out what train you're looking at. You may also hear references to symbols, such as a dispatcher saying that there's a Z train somewhere. It won't give you the specific symbol, but you'll at least have an idea. And that's really about it. The great thing about radio is you can just have it on in the background, as I did driving through Indiana and as I do every day at home, and you can still keep an ear on what's going on. I tried to cover everything I could think of, but if you still have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, with one exception. I will not take what channels are in use on my line requests, because in most cases I won't know and you can look it up just as easily as I can, and I don't want to clog up the comments section with it. Anything else though, fire away and I'll try to tackle it. You can follow me on Instagram and read the blog, links are in the video description. Until next time, I'm Tyler, and thank you for watching the Northeastern Illinois Railfan YouTube channel.